The sound still echoes in my dreams. Marcus's laughter cutting through the funeral parlor like broken glass, sharp enough to draw blood from 15 years of buried pain. "You won't get anything," he had declared, his voice booming over the whispered condolences and my daughter's quiet sobs. The mourners shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between my tear-stained face and his smug expression. My husband David's body lay not 20 feet away, still warm in his casket, and this monster was already dividing up his life like a vulture picking at roadkill. I remember every detail of that moment with crystalline clarity. The way Marcus's gold tooth caught the fluorescent light when he grinned, the smell of lilies mixing with his cheap cologne, the feel of my 8-year-old daughter Lily's hand trembling in mine as she tried to understand why her uncle was being cruel to her mother on the worst day of our lives. I said nothing then. What could I say? David's older brother had always been the family bully, the one who grabbed what he wanted and dared anyone to stop him. But 15 years teaches you things. 15 years of watching him live in the house that should have been mine and Lily's. 15 years of seeing him throw parties in the garden where David and I had planned to grow old together. 15 years of him answering David's phone number, sleeping in David's childhood bedroom, wearing David's father's watch like he had earned it through anything other than manipulation and intimidation. Marcus thought he was untouchable. After all, he had the deed. He had possession. He had the family's support, or at least their fearful compliance. What he didn't have was patience for details, and that would be his downfall. This morning, I stood outside the blue Victorian house on Elm Street, the morning mist clinging to its paint-chipped shutters like ghosts of better times. My hands weren't shaking as I clutched the manila envelope. They should have been. I had waited so long for this moment that I thought my body might betray me with nerves. Instead, I felt nothing but cold, calculated satisfaction. The doorbell's chime was the same melody David and I had heard on our wedding day when we visited his childhood home. Marcus appeared behind the glass, his hair thinner now, his belly rounder from years of easy living. When he opened the door, his expression shifted from annoyance to confusion, to something approaching fear as he recognized the look in my eyes. "Morning, Marcus," I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "We need to talk about David's house." The papers rustled in the envelope like dry leaves before a storm. 15 years of silence was about to end, and Marcus's comfortable world was about to discover what happens when you underestimate a grieving widow who has nothing left to lose. He stepped back instinctively, and I stepped forward. The game had finally begun. David used to say I was too trusting, too willing to see the good in people. "Aurora," he'd whisper while we lay in bed, "you give everyone the benefit of the doubt, even when they don't deserve it." He was talking about Marcus, of course. He was always talking about Marcus, though it took me years to understand why the mention of his older brother made David's jaw clench and his eyes darken. I met David in 1995 at the university library. He was researching property law for his master's thesis, and I was hiding from a thunderstorm with a stack of Victorian poetry. When lightning illuminated the reading room, I looked up to find him staring at me across the mahogany table, his brown eyes soft with curiosity. Our first date was dinner at a little Italian place where he told me about growing up in the blue house on Elm Street, about his parents who died in a car crash when he was 16, about Marcus who was supposed to take care of him, but mostly took care of himself. The Blackwood family house had been in their family for 4 generations. David's great-grandfather built it in 1892 with money from his successful grain business. Each generation had added their own touches: stained glass windows, a wraparound porch, built-in bookshelves that reached the ceiling. David loved that house with the fierce devotion of someone who had lost too much too young. Marcus was 7 years older and had inherited their father's mean streak, along with his piercing blue eyes. While David studied law and dreamed of justice, Marcus bounced from job to job, scheme to scheme, always looking for the easy way out. When their parents died, Marcus was supposed to be the responsible one, the guardian, the protector. Instead, he moved into the master bedroom and treated David like an unwelcome tenant in his own childhood home. "He used to lock me out," David confessed one night after too much wine. "Said I needed to learn independence. I spent half of senior year sleeping in the school library because I was too proud to ask friends for help." His fingers traced patterns on my skin as he spoke, and I felt his pain like a physical weight in my chest. By the time I met David, He had found his footing, built his life around the law firm where he worked, created distance from his brother's toxic presence. Marcus had moved to California chasing some business venture that never materialized, and the house stood empty except for David's weekend visits to tend the garden and pay the bills. Our wedding was small, held in that garden with white roses David's mother had planted 20 years earlier. Marcus didn't come, claimed he couldn't afford the plane ticket, though we later learned he'd spent that weekend in Vegas losing money at poker tables. David pretended it didn't hurt, but I saw how he kept glancing at the gate, hoping his brother might surprise him. When Lily was born 3 years later, Marcus sent a card with $20 inside and a note that said, "Buy something nice." David kept the card in his wallet until the day he died, though I never understood why. Now I think I know. It was evidence, proof of how little Marcus cared, how absent he chose to be from David's life until there was something worth taking. The house became our sanctuary. David would rush home from the law firm, sweep Lily into his arms, and the three of us would sit on the porch swing watching the sunset paint the sky purple and gold. Those were the golden years, the ones that made everything that came after feel like a punishment for being too happy. Marcus returned to town in 2006, broke and bitter, full of stories about bad luck and worse partners. David, being David, welcomed him with open arms and let him stay in the guest room, temporarily. That temporary stay lasted until David's heart attack 2 years later. I should have seen the signs then. The way Marcus started answering the phone when David wasn't home. How he began referring to our house instead of David's house. The subtle changes he made, moving furniture, throwing away David's books, replacing family photos with his own pictures. But I was grieving, drowning in my own loss, and I didn't have the energy to fight a battle I didn't even realize had begun. That was my mistake, the first of many. The law office smelled like old leather and broken dreams. I sat in the burgundy chair across from Mr. Pemberton, David's lawyer and longtime friend, with Lily pressed close against my side. She was only 8, too young to understand the legal terminology, but old enough to sense the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Marcus lounged in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. He wore David's navy suit. I recognized the small tear in the left sleeve that I had mended years ago, and his smirk suggested he already knew what the will contained. That should have been my first warning. David's wishes were quite specific, Mr. Pemberton began, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years practicing law. The will was thick, bound with a blue ribbon that trembled in his arthritic hands. The house on Elm Street, along with all its contents and the surrounding property, is to be held in trust for Lily Blackwood until she reaches the age of 25. Aurora Blackwood will serve as trustee and primary resident, with full authority over all decisions regarding the property. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time since David's funeral. He had protected us, as I always knew he would. Lily would inherit her father's beloved home, and we could continue living there, safe and secure. But Marcus was still smiling. "That's interesting," he said, leaning forward with the predatory grace of a shark sensing blood. "Because I have some documents that might complicate things." He pulled out a manila folder, worn at the edges, and slid it across Mr. Pemberton's desk. David signed these papers 3 months before his death, a loan agreement, with the house as collateral. My blood turned to ice water. Mr. Pemberton's face went ashen as he examined the documents. I could see David's signature, bold and familiar, and my world began to tilt sideways. "It appears," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "that David borrowed a substantial sum from me to cover some gambling debts. Legal gambling, of course. Bad investments in the stock market that went sour. He was too embarrassed to tell you, Aurora. Too proud to admit he'd made mistakes." Marcus shook his head sadly, a performance worthy of an Oscar. "The house was collateral for a loan of $300,000. Since the debt remains unpaid, and the estate doesn't have sufficient liquid assets to cover it, I'm afraid the house will need to be sold." The words hit me like physical blows. David gambling? David had always been cautious with money, almost paranoid about debt after growing up with financial insecurity. But there was his signature, witnessed and notarized. "This is impossible," I whispered. But even as I spoke, doubt crept into my voice. Had I known my husband as well as I thought? The stock market had been volatile those last months. David had been stressed about something, working late, taking phone calls in the other room. "I'm sorry, Aurora," Marcus said, and his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "But business is business." David would understand. He was a lawyer. He knew the consequences of defaulting on a secured loan. He paused, savoring the moment. "Of course I could let you rent the house from me. Family discount. Say, $2,000 a month? $2,000 a month. On my teacher's salary of $35,000 a year. He might as well have asked for my soul." Mr. Pemberton studied the documents with increasing dismay. Everything appeared to be in order. Signatures, dates, witness statements. If David had indeed borrowed money from Marcus using the house as collateral, and if the estate couldn't repay the debt, Marcus had every legal right to foreclose. "I'll need time to verify these documents," Mr. Pemberton said slowly, "to ensure their authenticity and examine the circumstances under which they were signed." "Of course," Marcus agreed magnanimously. "Take all the time you need. But until the debt is satisfied, I'll be moving back into the house to protect my investment. Just temporarily, you understand. That was 15 years ago. Marcus's temporary protection had lasted longer than my marriage. I left that office with my daughter's hand in mine and murder in my heart. Marcus had stolen our home, our security, our future with a few pieces of paper, and David's forged signature. Because I knew, somewhere deep in my bones, that David had never signed those documents willingly. The real question was, how could I prove it? The apartment above Rossetti's bakery became our refuge, though refuge was too generous a word for the cramped two-bedroom space that smelled permanently of yeast and broken dreams. The walls were thin enough that we could hear every conversation from the street below, every delivery truck that rumbled past at dawn, every argument from the neighbors who fought like their words were weapons. Lily adapted the way children do, with resilience that broke my heart and pragmatism that aged her beyond her years. She transformed the narrow hallway into a library, stacking her books in careful rows against the baseboard. The living room became her art studio, where she painted watercolor landscapes of the garden she could no longer play in. She never complained, never asked why we couldn't go home, never questioned why Uncle Marcus got to live in her daddy's house while we counted pennies for grocery money. My teaching salary stretched like taffy, covering rent and utilities but leaving nothing for extras. I took on tutoring jobs in the evenings, helping high school students with their college essays, while Lily did homework at the kitchen table. We ate pasta 3 nights a week and learned to find joy in dollar store treasures and library adventures. But every morning, I drove past the blue house on my way to school, and every morning, the sight of it drove splinters deeper into my heart. Marcus had painted over David's father's careful restoration work with garish yellow paint. He'd torn out my mother-in-law's rose garden and paved it for parking. The wraparound porch where David and I had shared our first kiss now sported plastic furniture and beer cans. He was destroying my husband's legacy one renovation at a time, and I was powerless to stop him. The legal battle dragged on for 3 years. Mr. Pemberton fought valiantly, but Marcus's documents appeared legitimate. The handwriting experts couldn't definitively prove forgery. The witnesses stood by their statements. The notary remembered the transaction clearly, or claimed to. Every month brought new expenses: court fees, expert witnesses, document analysis. My savings evaporated like morning dew, and still we were no closer to proving what I knew in my bones, that David would never have risked our home for any reason. "Maybe it's time to accept reality," Mr. Pemberton said gently during one of our meetings. He looked older, worn down by the endless appeals and motions. "Marcus has legal possession of the property. The debt appears legitimate. Perhaps it would be better to focus on building a new life, rather than fighting an unwinnable battle." But I couldn't let go. Every night, I spread David's financial records across our tiny dining table, searching for clues I might have missed. Every weekend, I visited the courthouse, digging through property records and loan documents, looking for inconsistencies. Lily grew older, wiser, more beautiful with each passing year. She excelled in school despite our circumstances, or perhaps because of them. Her teachers praised her maturity, her determination, her kindness to classmates who had less than she did, which was saying something, considering how little we had. "I'm going to be a lawyer like Daddy," she announced on her 13th birthday. "I'm going to help people who can't help themselves." I knew she was talking about me, about us, about the injustice that had shaped her childhood. My heart swelled with pride and broke with sorrow simultaneously. My daughter shouldn't have to fight battles that were never hers to begin with. Marcus, meanwhile, lived like a king in David's castle. I heard rumors through mutual acquaintances. The parties that lasted until dawn, the motorcycles parked on the front lawn, the women who came and went like seasons. He'd taken early retirement from the insurance company where he'd worked sporadically, claiming disability for a back injury that didn't prevent him from playing weekend basketball. Sometimes I'd see him at the grocery store, pushing a cart full of expensive steaks and imported beer while I clipped coupons for generic cereal. He'd nod cordially, ask about Lily's grades, make small talk as if we were old friends rather than enemies locked in a war he'd already won. "How's the apartment treating you?" he asked once, his voice dripping with false concern. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." His smile was all teeth and malice. I wanted to claw his eyes out. Instead, I smiled back and said, "We're doing just fine, thank you." But we weren't fine. We were surviving, which was different. And survival, I was learning, required patience, planning, and the kind of cold determination that grew stronger with each passing year. Because I had made a decision somewhere in those long, lonely nights. I would prove David's innocence. I would expose Marcus's lies. I would reclaim what was rightfully ours. It would just take longer than I had originally hoped. Much longer. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but after 10 years of waiting, mine had frozen solid. I'd learned patience the way other people learn languages, through immersion, repetition, and the gradual understanding that mastery requires time. Lily was 18 now, beautiful and brilliant, with her father's eyes and my stubborn streak. She'd earned a full scholarship to study pre-law at the state university, and every achievement felt like a small victory against Marcus's attempts to diminish our family's worth. But she worried about leaving me alone in the apartment above the bakery, worried that her absence would somehow make me smaller. "I could defer for a year," she suggested over dinner one night, her fork pushing pasta around her plate without eating. "Stay here? Get a job? Help with expenses?" "Absolutely not," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fought too hard for her daughter's future to let it slip away. "Your education is the most important thing. Everything else can wait." But privately, I was relieved she'd be gone. The work I needed to do required secrecy, and secrets were easier to keep when you didn't have to explain why you were spending every evening at the courthouse, or why you'd developed friendships with court clerks and records administrators. Because I'd discovered something interesting during my years of quiet investigation. Marcus wasn't as clever as he thought he was. The loan documents that had stolen our house were perfect. Too perfect. The signatures matched David's handwriting flawlessly, which should have been impossible since forgers always leave tells. Tiny inconsistencies that betray their deception. But these documents showed no signs of forgery because they weren't forged in the traditional sense. I'd found the truth buried in David's office files, hidden in a folder marked estate planning. 3 months before his death, David had indeed signed loan documents, but not for gambling debts. He'd taken out a legitimate business loan to expand his law practice, with plans to hire 2 junior associates and lease a larger office space. The loan was secured by the house, standard practice for business financing. But something had gone wrong. The business expansion never happened. David died before the loan proceeds were ever dispersed. And somehow, Marcus had gotten hold of the original paperwork. The beauty of his scheme was its simplicity. He hadn't forged anything. He'd simply substituted his name for the legitimate lender's name on documents David had actually signed. A little creative editing, some new witness signatures, and a corrupt notary had transformed a legitimate business loan into a personal debt owed to Marcus. It was brilliant. It was also completely illegal. The challenge was proving it. The original lender had been a small regional bank that had been acquired by a larger institution shortly after David's death. The records were buried in corporate archives, accessible only through subpoenas I couldn't afford to pursue. The witnesses to the fraudulent documents had conveniently moved out of state. The notary had died in a car accident 2 years after the supposed loan was executed. Marcus had covered his tracks well, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd gotten greedy. I discovered it on a Thursday evening in November, while scrolling through county property records online. Marcus had taken out a home equity line of credit against David's house. Our house. Just 6 months earlier. The loan was for $150,000, secured by property he claimed to own free and clear. But according to his own fraudulent documents, the house was already encumbered by his loan to David. A property can't secure 2 loans totaling more than its value without the lenders knowing about each other. Either Marcus had lied to the new lender about the existing debt, or he'd perjured himself in the original probate proceedings about the loan's legitimacy. Either way, he'd committed felony fraud. I printed out every document, every form, every piece of evidence I could find. I cross-referenced dates, tracked down corporate filings, built a timeline that told the story of Marcus's deception in excruciating detail. Then I made an appointment with the district attorney's office. Special prosecutor Janet Morrison was younger than I'd expected, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that reminded me of a bird of prey. She listened to my presentation without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated she understood the complexity of financial fraud. "This is sophisticated work," she said when I finished. "You've essentially done our investigation for us." She leaned back in her chair, studying the evidence spread across her desk. "The question is, are you willing to testify? Because once we file charges, there's no going back. Marcus will know you're the one who brought him down." I thought about 15 years of exile. 15 years of watching my daughter grow up in poverty while her inheritance was squandered. 15 years of Marcus's smug satisfaction every time our paths crossed. "I've been waiting 15 years for this conversation," I said. "I'm more than ready." Ms. Morrison smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut steel. "Then let's destroy him." The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. It would be another 6 months before the indictments were issued, another year before the trial began. But Marcus's comfortable life was about to become very uncomfortable. He just didn't know it yet. The knock came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March. I knew because I'd been awake since 5, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee and case files, preparing for another day of watching Marcus's world unravel from a distance. Through the thin apartment walls, I could hear Mrs. Rossetti starting the ovens downstairs, the familiar rhythm of her morning routine marking time in my temporary life. Detective Ray Kowalski stood in my doorway with the patient expression of someone who delivered bad news professionally for 20 years. His gray mustache twitched when he spoke, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much of humanity's worst impulses. "Ms. Blackwood," he said, removing his cap, "we need to discuss the Marcus Blackwood investigation." I invited him in, cleared legal documents off my table, and poured him coffee from the pot I'd been nursing since dawn. He sat heavily in my mismatched kitchen chair and pulled out a notebook that had seen better decades. "The district attorney's office asked me to look into some additional aspects of your brother-in-law's financial activities," he began. "What we found goes deeper than simple loan fraud." My hand steadied around my coffee mug. After 15 years of fighting alone, it felt surreal to have law enforcement taking my side. "Marcus has been running sophisticated financial schemes for at least 20 years. Detective Kowalski continued. "The business with your house was just one piece of a much larger pattern. We've identified at least 12 other victims. Widows, elderly homeowners, people who trusted him because of his insurance background and professional appearance. The news hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just stolen from us. He was a career criminal who preyed on vulnerable people. How many families had he destroyed while I focused only on my own pain? There's something else," the detective said, his voice gentling. "We found evidence that your husband knew about Marcus's criminal activities, had known for years." My coffee mug slipped from numb fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. "That's impossible. David would have—" "Your husband was building a case against his brother," Detective Kowalski interrupted. "A comprehensive investigation into Marcus's insurance fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse schemes. We found his files hidden in a safety deposit box that Marcus never knew existed." He handed me a manila folder thick with photocopied documents. David's handwriting filled the margins, dates, and connections drawn in his precise legal script. Bank statements, forged signatures, victim testimonies David had quietly collected over months of careful investigation. David was planning to turn his brother into authorities, the detective explained. The business loan he applied for wasn't for expanding his practice. It was seed money for a victim compensation fund. He wanted to make restitution to Marcus's victims before pressing charges. The room spun around me. My husband, my gentle, trusting David, had been conducting a secret investigation that could have sent his brother to prison. And Marcus had somehow discovered it. "You think Marcus killed him?" I whispered. Detective Kowalski's expression grew carefully neutral. "Your husband's death was ruled a heart attack. But given what we now know about Marcus's criminal sophistication and his access to pharmaceutical substances through his insurance connections," he shrugged. "We've requested that the medical examiner review the autopsy findings." I stared at the documents spread across my table, evidence of a husband I'd never fully known, and a brother-in-law whose evil ran deeper than I'd imagined. David had been protecting people, fighting for justice even at the cost of family loyalty, and I'd spent 15 years thinking he'd betrayed us with gambling debts. "There's one more thing," Detective Kowalski said. "We found a letter your husband wrote to you. It was in the safety deposit box, meant to be delivered if anything happened to him. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive stationery that David used for important correspondence. My name was written across the front in his careful handwriting, and the paper trembled in my hands as I opened it. My dearest Aurora, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and Marcus has discovered my investigation. I pray I'm wrong, that years of paranoia about my brother's activities have made me overcautious. But if something happens to me, you need to know the truth. Marcus is not the harmless failure he pretends to be. He's a predator who has stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from vulnerable people. I have evidence of his crimes, but gathering it has put our family in danger. He's already threatened Lily indirectly, making comments about how accidents happen to children when families don't cooperate. I've taken out a legitimate business loan as cover for investigating his activities. If I die before exposing him, Marcus will try to steal our house using forged documents. Fight him, Aurora. The evidence is all here, and the truth will prevail if you're strong enough to see it through. Tell Lily her father loved her more than life itself. Tell her that sometimes the greatest act of love is standing up to bullies, even when those bullies are family. I love you both beyond words. Be brave. Forever yours, David. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated my grief-stricken brain. David had known. He'd known Marcus would come for our house, had known his own life was in danger, but he'd continued his investigation anyway because other people needed protection. My husband was a hero, and I'd spent 15 years doubting him. "We'll need you to testify about the letter," Detective Kowalski said gently, "and about your husband's behavior in the months before his death. Any changes in routine, unusual stress, conversations that seemed odd at the time." I nodded, though tears were streaming down my face. After all these years of feeling powerless, of watching Marcus destroy everything David had built, justice was finally within reach. But it came too late to save my marriage from doubt. Too late to tell David I was sorry for not believing in him. Too late for so many things that mattered. The trial was still months away, but Marcus's reckoning had already begun. The indictments came down on a Thursday morning in September, delivered by federal marshals who arrived at the Blue House on Elm Street, with warrants and television crews. I watched from my car parked across the street, 15 years of patience finally bearing fruit as Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his confident swagger replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man whose world had imploded. The local news ran the story as their lead item. Local man arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. They showed footage of Marcus doing his perp walk, his lawyer issuing no-comment responses to shouted questions, and file photos of some of his victims, elderly women whose retirement savings he'd stolen, widowed men whose trust he'd betrayed. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt hollow, like a balloon with all the air slowly leaking out. Revenge was supposed to taste sweeter. Lily called from college that evening, her voice tight with emotions I couldn't identify. "Mom, I saw the news. Are we going to get the house back?" "It's complicated," I said, which had become my standard response to questions about the future. The house was evidence now, tied up in legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. Even if we ultimately won, the property had been damaged by 15 years of Marcus's neglect. The garden was gone. The original hardwood floors had been covered with cheap carpet, and the kitchen where David's mother had taught me to make her secret marinara sauce had been gutted and modernized, with particle board cabinets and linoleum countertops. "I've been thinking about Dad's letter," Lily said, "about what he said regarding standing up to bullies." Something in her tone made me pay closer attention. "What about it?" "I did some research at the law library here. About Marcus's victims, the other families he destroyed." Her voice grew stronger, more determined. "There's something you need to know, Mom. Something I found that the police might have missed." She discovered what I should have found years earlier, if I'd been smart enough to look beyond my own pain. Marcus's first victim had been his own parents. The car accident that killed David's parents in 1987 hadn't been an accident at all. Marcus had tampered with the brakes on their car after discovering they planned to change their will to leave everything to David. He'd killed his own parents for inheritance money, then spent the next 30 years perfecting his techniques on strangers. "The police reports are all there," Lily explained, her voice shaking with the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. The brake lines were cut, but the investigating officer was Marcus's buddy from high school. He ruled it mechanical failure and closed the case. No one questioned it because Marcus seemed so grief-stricken, so devoted to taking care of his younger brother. My hands shook as I absorbed this new layer of Marcus's evil. He'd murdered David's parents, stolen David's inheritance, then spent decades preying on other families while playing the role of caring older brother, and David had died trying to expose him. "There's more," Lily continued. "I found medical records showing Marcus had access to digitalis through his insurance job. It's a heart medication that can trigger fatal heart attacks if administered in the wrong dosage. The same drug that killed Dad." I had to sit down. The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just stolen our house. He'd murdered my husband and gotten away with it for 15 years. "We have to tell Detective Kowalski," I managed to say. "I already called him," Lily said. "He's reopening the investigation into Grandpa and Grandma's deaths, and he's requesting Dad's medical records from the coroner. Mom, we're going to get him. We're going to get him for everything." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and finally let myself feel the full weight of 15 years' worth of suppressed rage. Marcus had destroyed my family systematically, methodically, with the cold calculation of someone who viewed other people as obstacles to overcome rather than human beings deserving of respect. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the women in the Blackwood family. The next morning, I drove past the house on Elm Street one more time. Crime scene tape fluttered in the autumn breeze, and the yellow paint Marcus had applied to the Victorian siding looked garish in the morning sunlight. But underneath that paint, David's careful restoration work remained. The bones of our home were still strong. I parked across the street and pulled out my cell phone. Detective Kowalski answered on the second ring. "I want to make a deal," I said without preamble. "What kind of deal?" Marcus took a plea bargain on the financial fraud charges. 5 years in minimum security, eligible for parole in 3. That's not enough. Not for what he's done. Ms. Blackwood, with the evidence your daughter found, we can charge him with multiple homicides. He's looking at life in prison. But trials are uncertain, I said. Juries are unpredictable. Evidence gets excluded on technicalities. I want a guarantee. Detective Kowalski was quiet for a long moment. What are you proposing? Let me talk to him. Let me get a confession on tape. Marcus is arrogant. He'll want to brag about how clever he's been. Give me one conversation, and I'll hand you everything you need to put him away forever. That's dangerous, and possibly illegal. I looked at the house where my husband had grown up, where we'd planned to grow old together, where Marcus had lived in luxury, while my daughter and I scraped by in poverty. Detective, I said, I've been planning this conversation for 15 years. I know exactly what to say. The county jail visiting room smelled like disinfectant and desperation, a sterile space designed to strip away dignity along with freedom. I sat at the scarred metal table, my hands folded calmly in my lap, while Marcus shuffled in wearing orange coveralls and the bewildered expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed overnight. He looked older, diminished somehow by the institutional lighting and the reality of consequences finally catching up with him. His hair had gone completely gray, and the confident swagger that had intimidated me for so many years had been replaced by the uncertain gait of a man who no longer controlled his environment. "Aurora," he said, settling into the plastic chair across from me. "I have to say, I'm surprised you came. After all the unpleasantness. As if 15 years of stolen inheritance and murdered family members could be dismissed so casually. "I wanted to see you before the trial," I said, keeping my voice neutral. The wire Detective Kowalski had given me was taped to my ribs, invisible beneath my conservative sweater, but feeling as obvious as a neon sign. "To understand why you did it." Marcus studied my face, looking for tells, for signs of the trap that was closing around him. But I'd had 15 years to perfect my poker face, 15 years to learn how to hide my true thoughts behind a mask of resignation. "You always were too emotional, Aurora." David was the same way, led by feelings instead of logic. He leaned back in his chair, already beginning to relax as his ego took over. "Sometimes family requires tough love. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions for everyone's good." "Is that what you call murdering your parents? Tough love?" The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a gun. Marcus's eyes widened fractionally before he recovered his composure, but I'd seen the flash of surprise. He hadn't expected me to know about that. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost its casual confidence. "Brake lines don't cut themselves, Marcus, and corrupt cops don't stay bought forever." I leaned forward slightly, letting him see the steel that 15 years of survival had forged in my spine. "Detective Morrison found your father's mechanic. The one who told the original investigator that the brakes had been tampered with. The one whose testimony was mysteriously lost in the files." Marcus's face went pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "You can't prove anything. That was 35 years ago. Evidence degrades, witnesses die, memories fade. Some memories are crystal clear," I said, "like the memory of watching my husband die from a heart attack that didn't make medical sense. Like the memory of you moving into our house before David was even buried. Like the memory of you laughing at his funeral and telling me I wouldn't get anything." "David was weak," Marcus snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. "He always was weak. Bleeding heart liberal who couldn't see the forest for the trees. Did you know he was going to turn me in? His own brother? After everything I did for him?" My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my expression calm. "What did you do for him, Marcus?" "I protected him." The words exploded out of him with 15 years of pent-up resentment. "When our parents wanted to change their will and leave everything to precious little David, I made sure that didn't happen. When David got too nosy about my business affairs, I made sure he couldn't cause problems for anyone." "You killed them," I said quietly. "You killed your own parents for money." "I saved the family legacy." Marcus's voice rose, and a guard looked in our direction. He lowered his tone but continued with the fervor of someone finally able to tell his story. "Our parents were going to give everything to David because he was the responsible one. They didn't understand that responsibility means making hard choices. They didn't see that David would have given it all away to his charity cases and bleeding heart causes. I thought about David's letter, about his plan to compensate Marcus's victims from his own resources. My husband would have given away the family fortune to help people Marcus had destroyed. In David's moral universe, that would have been the right thing to do. And David?" I prompted. Marcus's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "David was building a file on me, thought he was being clever, gathering evidence like some kind of detective, but I knew about his safety deposit box. I knew about his meetings with victims. I knew he was planning to destroy me." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Digitalis is a wonderful drug, Aurora. Just a small amount in his coffee, and his weak heart couldn't handle the stress. Natural causes. No investigation. No questions." The confession was more complete than Detective Kowalski had dared hope for. Marcus had just admitted to premeditated murder on tape, in a room monitored by the county sheriff's department. "And the house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The house was always going to be mine," Marcus said with the satisfaction of someone explaining a particularly clever chess move. David had legitimately signed loan documents for his business expansion. All I had to do was substitute my name for the bank's name and create some supporting paperwork. Brilliant, really. I used David's own signature against him. What about Lily? What about your 8-year-old niece who lost her father and her home? For just a moment, something that might have been shame flickered across Marcus's features. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold indifference I'd seen at David's funeral. Children are resilient, he said. Lily turned out fine, didn't she? College scholarship, bright future ahead of her. I probably did her a favor, taught her that life isn't fair, that you have to fight for what you want. I stood up slowly, my legs surprisingly steady, despite the magnitude of what I'd just heard. 15 years of questions had been answered in 10 minutes of Marcus's ego-driven confession. You're right about one thing, I said, looking down at the man who had destroyed my family. Lily did learn to fight for what she wants, and what she wants is justice for her father. Marcus's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? I smiled for the first time since entering the visiting room. It felt strange on my face, like a muscle I'd forgotten how to use. Every word you just said was recorded, Marcus. The district attorney's office, the FBI, Detective Kowalski, they're all listening. I gestured toward the camera mounted in the corner of the room. You just confessed to multiple murders and fraud schemes on tape, in front of witnesses. The color drained from Marcus's face as the full implications hit him. He'd been so eager to brag about his cleverness that he'd walked straight into a trap 15 years in the making. You can't, this isn't legal. You tricked me, he sputtered. I asked you questions and you answered them, I said calmly. No tricks, no coercion, just a conversation between family members. I picked up my purse and headed for the door. Goodbye, Marcus. I don't expect we'll see each other again. Behind me, I heard him shouting, demanding lawyers, claiming entrapment, but his words faded as the heavy door closed between us. In the hallway, Detective Kowalski waited with a smile that could have powered the entire building. Outstanding work, he said. That confession will put him away for life without possibility of parole. I nodded, feeling strangely empty now that the moment I'd waited 15 years for had finally arrived. What happens now? Now we go get your house back, he said. And then we start notifying Marcus's other victims that they're finally going to see justice. As we walked toward the exit, I thought about David's letter, about his belief that the greatest act of love was standing up to bullies. My husband would have been proud of what Lily and I had accomplished. We'd stood up to the biggest bully of all, and we'd won. The war was finally over. The courtroom was packed with faces I didn't recognize. Reporters, legal observers, and most importantly, Marcus's victims. Elderly women clutched their purses like lifelines, their eyes holding the hollow look of people who'd learned not to trust easily. Middle-aged men in their best suits sat beside adult children who'd driven hours to witness justice for parents who hadn't lived to see this day. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting suit, his court-appointed attorney whispering urgently in his ear. Gone was the swagger, the predatory confidence that had intimidated me for so many years. In its place sat a broken man who'd finally run out of schemes and scapegoats. District Attorney Janet Morrison stood to deliver her opening statement, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built her career on protecting the vulnerable from predators like Marcus. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began. Over the next 2 weeks, you will hear about a man who spent 3 decades systematically destroying families for profit. A man who murdered his own parents when they threatened to change their will. A man who killed his brother when that brother tried to expose his crimes. A man who stole homes, savings accounts, and life insurance policies from widows, orphans, and elderly citizens who trusted him because he appeared to be a respectable insurance professional. I sat in the gallery's front row, Lily beside me, both of us wearing the navy blue dresses we'd bought specifically for this occasion. My daughter had taken a leave of absence from law school to be here, to see justice served for the father she'd lost too young. The prosecution's case unfolded like a masterclass in methodical evidence presentation. Financial experts testified about the sophisticated nature of Marcus's fraud schemes. Medical examiners explained how digitalis could trigger fatal heart attacks in healthy individuals. Handwriting analysts demonstrated how Marcus had altered legitimate documents to create fraudulent loan agreements. But it was the victim's testimony that truly condemned him. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, 83 years old, described how Marcus had convinced her to take out a reverse mortgage on her family home, then disappeared with the proceeds, leaving her homeless in her final years. Her voice shook as she testified. but her determination was steel. Robert Chen told the jury about his father, a Korean War veteran who trusted Marcus with his disability payments and life savings. "My father fought for this country," Mr. Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. "He survived combat, poverty, and discrimination. But he couldn't survive Marcus Blackwood's greed. One by one, they took the stand. 15 families destroyed by Marcus's schemes, their stories weaving together into a tapestry of systematic abuse that left no doubt about the defendant's guilt. When the prosecution played the recording of Marcus's jailhouse confession, the courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of his voice detailing his crimes with casual indifference. Several jurors visibly recoiled when he described murdering his parents, and one elderly woman in the gallery began crying quietly. Marcus's defense attorney tried valiantly to argue that the confession had been coerced, that Marcus had been under duress, that his words had been taken out of context. But the recording was clear, unambiguous, and devastating. Marcus had confessed to multiple murders with the satisfaction of someone finally able to boast about his cleverness. "My client was grieving," the defense attorney argued desperately. "Confused, medicated, not thinking clearly. You can't convict a man based on words spoken in emotional distress." But District Attorney Morrison destroyed that argument during cross-examination. She played additional recordings of Marcus's phone calls from jail, conversations where he'd bragged to other inmates about his schemes, where he'd laughed about stupid victims who'd trusted him. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Patricia Hendricks asked. The foreman, a middle-aged construction worker with calloused hands and kind eyes, stood slowly. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Robert Blackwood. How do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Margaret Blackwood. How do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of David Blackwood. How do you find?" "Guilty." The guilty verdicts continued for 27 separate felony counts. Marcus sat motionless as each one was read, his face gray with the realization that his life was effectively over. Judge Hendricks set sentencing for the following month, but everyone in the courtroom knew the outcome. 3 first-degree murder convictions carried mandatory life sentences without possibility of parole. As the courtroom emptied, I found myself surrounded by Marcus's other victims, people whose names I'd studied but whose faces I'd never seen. They thanked me for my persistence, for refusing to let Marcus's crimes remain hidden, for giving them a chance to see justice served. "Your husband would be proud," Mrs. Vasquez said, her arthritic hands squeezing mine with surprising strength. "He started this fight, but you finished it." Outside the courthouse, Lily and I stood on the steps where reporters were conducting interviews with prosecutors and victims' families. The late afternoon sun painted the courthouse dome gold, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt something approaching peace. "It's over," Lily said, slipping her arm through mine. "Yes," I agreed. "It's finally over." But even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Marcus would spend the rest of his life in prison, but that wouldn't bring back the people he'd killed or restore the years he'd stolen from his victims. Justice had been served, but justice wasn't the same as healing. That would take longer, maybe much longer. But for the first time since David's death, I believed healing was possible. The key felt foreign in my hand after 15 years, but the lock turned as smoothly as if I'd used it yesterday. The front door of the blue house on Elm Street swung open with a soft creak, revealing the hallway where David had carried me across the threshold as a new bride, where Lily had taken her first steps, where our family had built memories that Marcus's crimes couldn't erase. The house was different, of course. Marcus's renovations had covered David's careful restoration work with cheap materials and thoughtless modifications. But underneath the damage, the bones of our home remained strong. The crown molding David's grandfather had installed by hand, the built-in bookshelves where David had kept his law texts, and I'd displayed my teaching awards, the bay window in the living room where we'd planned to put a Christmas tree every year for the rest of our lives. "It's smaller than I remembered," Lily said, running her fingers along the banister David had refinished during our first summer in the house. She was 23 now, graduated from law school with honors, beginning her career as a public defender, helping families like ours navigate legal systems designed to protect the powerful. You were 8 when we left, I reminded her. Everything seems smaller when you grow up. We walked through the room slowly, cataloging the damage and planning the restoration. The hardwood floors were salvageable beneath Marcus's carpeting. The kitchen could be returned to its original charm with some effort and investment. The garden would take years to rebuild, but David's mother's rose bushes had survived Marcus's neglect, their thorny stems promising beauty to come. In the master bedroom, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. Hidden behind the cheap paneling Marcus had installed, someone had carved initials into the original plaster wall. DB plus AM forever. David had carved those letters during our engagement, a secret love note that only we would ever see. Marcus had covered them, but he hadn't erased them. They'd been waiting here all along, patient as promises, enduring as hope. "Mom?" Lily called from the kitchen. "You need to see this." I found her standing beside the window that overlooked the back garden, holding a manila envelope that had been taped to the inside of a cabinet door. "It's addressed to you," she said, handing me the envelope. In Dad's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a deed, the original deed to the house, signed over to me and Lily jointly, dated 3 days before David's death. With it was a note in David's careful script. "Aurora, if you're reading this, it means my investigation succeeded, and Marcus has been exposed for what he truly is. This deed was filed with the county recorder's office before I died, but I hid a copy here in case Marcus tried to destroy the original records. The house was always meant to be yours and Lily's. I legally transferred it to both of you before taking out the business loan, specifically to protect it from creditors, or from family members who might try to steal it. Marcus's loan documents are completely fraudulent. He never had any legal claim to this property. I hope you discover this quickly, but knowing my brother's cleverness, it may take years to unravel his schemes. I love you both beyond measure. Build a beautiful life in this house. Fill it with laughter and love and all the things Marcus tried to steal from us. David." I sank into Marcus's cheap kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of David's final gift. He'd protected us legally as well as financially, ensuring that even if his murder went undetected, we would eventually reclaim our rightful inheritance. "He knew," Lily whispered, reading over my shoulder. "Dad knew exactly what Marcus would try to do, and he stopped him." It took 6 months to complete the legal process of reclaiming the house. Marcus's fraudulent loan was voided. His home equity debt was transferred to a property he actually owned, and the county recorder's office officially acknowledged our legal ownership. The Victims' Compensation Fund, established with money recovered from Marcus's various accounts, helped repair some of the financial damage he'd caused to other families. Marcus himself was serving 3 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security prison, where his complaints about unfair treatment and prosecutorial misconduct fell on deaf ears. He would die behind bars, forgotten by everyone except his victims and the families he'd destroyed. But this story isn't really about Marcus. It's about the women who refused to let him win. Lily now runs a nonprofit legal clinic specializing in elder abuse and inheritance fraud. She's helped dozens of families expose similar schemes, using lessons learned from our 15-year battle to fight for justice more efficiently. Her father's spirit lives on in every case she wins, every family she protects from predators like Marcus. I returned to teaching, but now I also speak at conferences about financial fraud awareness. I tell our story to groups of seniors, widows, and families who trust too easily and suffer too quietly when that trust is betrayed. If my pain can prevent others from experiencing similar losses, then perhaps it served a purpose. The house on Elm Street has been restored to its original beauty. David's mother's roses bloom again in the back garden. The Christmas tree fills the bay window every December, just as we'd planned. Lily brings her own children here for holidays, and their laughter echoes through rooms that Marcus tried to claim but never truly owned. Sometimes I sit on the front porch where David and I used to watch sunsets, and I think about justice. Real justice isn't just punishment for the guilty. It's restoration for the innocent. It's taking back what was stolen, rebuilding what was destroyed, and creating beauty where others tried to plant seeds of bitterness. Marcus thought he'd won when he laughed at David's funeral and told me I wouldn't get anything. But he was wrong about what mattered. Love matters. Truth matters. Family matters. Justice, when it finally comes, matters most of all. The house is ours again, as it was always meant to be. And every morning when I wake up in the bedroom where David carved our initials into the wall, I remember that some things can't be stolen, no matter how hard evil people try. Some things endure forever,